This is a story he's being told by his mother. His father never spoke a word of the execution to anyone except his wife, Camus' mother. Camus says, what he saw that morning, he never told anyone. My mother relates merely that he came rushing home, his face distorted, refused to talk, lay down for a moment on the bed, and suddenly began to vomit. He had just discovered the reality hidden under the noble phrases with which it was masked. Instead of thinking of the slaughtered children, he could think of nothing but the quivering body that had just been dropped. He could think of nothing but the quivering body that had just been dropped onto a board to have its head cut off. His father, in my perspective, became enlightened after that moment of darkness when he witnessed the execution. Camus goes on, and if you're not familiar with Reflections from the Guillotine, Camus speaks very eloquently, very powerfully, and very consistently against the death penalty. He does so in what I call a postmodern imagination, or with a postmodern imagination, because he tells us in his essay, he proposes this somewhat facetiously, but he proposes that if people were made to touch the wood and steel of the guillotine, he's speaking, and to hear the sound of a head falling, the public imagination, suddenly awakened, will repudiate both the vocabulary and the penalty. And one of the things that postmodern criticism does for us is it calls our attention to the use of language and the power of language in molding our understanding of reality and our perceptions of reality. And frequently when we talk about the death penalty, we talk about it in veiled terms, vague kind of death penalty. We don't talk about killing. We don't talk about the life that is being ended, but we talk about the administration of something distant and remote. Even in Camus' time, he was very, very drawn to the language. He's a writer, and so naturally he would be. But he talks about how at that period of time, journalists and politicians and public officials were referring to the guillotine, which was the new instrument to perfect the death penalty. It was the instrument that was going to humanize the killing process. They called the death penalty the shunting machine, and they referred to the condemned as the client, or even more offensively from Camus' perspective, the parcel. And so the parcel was delivered to the executioner and the sentence was carried out. And people who walked valiantly and walked to the guillotine and voluntarily kneeled down and let their heads be severed were called courageous. But those who fought with them, or those who resisted, or those who cried out in horror at what they were anticipating were called cowards. Camus suggests that it should be just the opposite, that the cowardly thing to do is to give your life away to a machine that is going to end it, rather than risk the bullet in the back of a head by a soldier who's guarding you as you try to flee from the executioner's machine or the shunting machine. But nonetheless, even in 1957 and the late 50s, the language of the death machine was of concern to Camus. And you get the impression here that he believes that if people were made to witness the executions, there would be a repudiation, not only of the vocabulary, but of the punishment. And he knows that's not been historically the fact. He knows that historically executions have been publicized. And in fact, some of the stories he talks about have instances where people are pickpocketing during executions and subsequently being executed themselves. He talks about instances where executioners commit crimes that carry them to the gallows or to the guillotine themselves. And so the idea that witnessing executions will really stop people in their tracks was perhaps a literary trick that he was using to make us think about the horror of the process. But perhaps it was also a reflection on what happened when his father witnessed this execution. And you notice he doesn't just simply say witness the execution, but he says touch the wood and steel of the machine and hear the sound of the head falling and rolling. He wants us not to just simply witness, but to experience the horror of this shunting machine. And he believed that it would cause us to shift our focus and move. It's important to note, though, that Camus, as a postmodern critic, and Camus as an advocate for the abolition of the death penalty, talks about a goal that he says that there is a solidarity of all men in error and aberration, and he believes that justice requires a certain sense of compassion. Compassion is what Camus believes we need to be able to demonstrate in the face of horror. But it's important, he says, for us to recognize that compassion does not exclude punishment. We tend to think of the compassionate response as that loving, caring response. But Camus was a typical postmodern critic. In my sense of postmodernism is that they've lost hope. And they have a sense of hopelessness, and the compassion that he believes is a punitive compassion that will come forward, that we can in fact, he says, subject the condemned or subject the murderers to punishments that are far worse than the guillotine. And life imprisonment and hard labor is his example. That condemning a human to a life of confinement with loss of liberty and loss of freedom to a life of hard labor under unnatural conditions would be more punitive than simply carrying them to the center of the town and chopping off their head, which ends their horror in a moment or in an instant. And so he believes that what should happen is that as we recognize our, what he calls solidarity of all men in error and aberration, he believes that what should happen is that we should recognize that we are inevitably going to make mistakes. A solidarity in error. We will make mistakes. We will execute innocent people. Today, there's a lot of concern about the issue of executing innocent people, and the possibility is horrific for those people who stop and think about the prospect of executing someone innocent. So for that reason alone, Camus says, we should, once we come to an awareness of what's going on, we should demand a stop to it, because hypothetically, one of us could find ourselves sitting at the executioner's table, waiting to be executed for a crime we didn't commit. But even more importantly, I think, is this solidarity, he says, of man in our aberrations. That not only are we inevitably going to commit error, but we have, he believes, a fundamental nature that is what he calls later he uses the language of sadism. He says that that holding on to the death penalty in light of everything that we know about it in 1957, everything that we know about the fallibility of the machine, everything we know about the social conditions that help contribute to the problems of violent crime that ultimately lead to murders, and by the way, at this time, not even murderers were the only people being executed. People were being executed for a wide variety of crimes. And his argument is that there's a sense that we should come to a sense of solidarity with the inevitability of error, and come to an awareness that what we are doing in the act of executing, what we are doing in the administration of the punishment, is only understandable in the mind of a sadist. That what we're doing is futile. Killing people doesn't stop crime. Some will argue in fact, it creates more. The brutalization effect literature that some of us are familiar with suggests that that's what's happening in modern time, that executions are actually being excited. Executions are exciting violence rather than deterring it. But he says that if we hold on to this punishment as a foundation of a sense of justice or a system of justice, that the only thing that we must admit is not only are we inevitably going to err, but we are sadists. We have a natural sadistic tendency. And that's a very hopeless kind of statement of man. And I'm here to challenge that. I'm not going to reinforce Camus' principle of our sadism, but it's important for us to recognize